All right, we're live.
Okay, so I think we'll just give a couple of minutes for people to join, and then we'll get started on how to define your field for EB-1A purposes.
Sounds good.
And for anyone who's joined, hi, how are you doing today? Feel free to write in the comments any questions as the call progresses as well. I'm happy to address them during the call or after some kind of brief introductory comments on how you define your field.
All right, let's get started.
Yeah. So I think just getting started, wherever you are on your EB-1A journey, I think defining your field is a crucial element of your case. When you're preparing an EB-1A petition, as I mentioned, defining your field of expertise is really crucial to demonstrating that you've reached the top of your industry. So this is really the process about telling a compelling story of how you've risen to the very top of your field. You're not necessarily relying on percentiles, for example, so you're not necessarily trying to prove that you are in the top 1%, the top 5%, or the top 10% of your field, because percentiles are subjective and inconsistently kind of applied, and we don't actually know how USCIS really defines the top of your field in terms of percentiles. So the focus is more so on showcasing kind of clear, objective evidence of your extraordinary ability, showing that you're widely recognized and celebrated within your field. So when you're kind of defining your field, this is at the outset of your case. Again, as I mentioned, you're kind of, rather than focusing on rankings in your field, you're really, the emphasis should be on kind of significant contributions to your field that you have made a lasting impact. And it's really about kind of striking a balance here, I would say, when you're defining your field. And I would say that, so you need to accurately define your field, because ultimately, at the end of the day, how you define your field is who you are comparing yourself to. So proving that you are in the top of those individuals, you have to identify the group that you are comparing yourself to. And you also have to ensure that you're identifying that group kind of accurately. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. And as I mentioned, it's really a matter of kind of striking a balance when you're looking to define your field for EB-1A purposes, because you're balancing kind of, you don't want your field to be defined too broadly, because it can dilute the significance of the contributions that you've made to your field, and it can actually make it harder for you to demonstrate that you're among the top experts. But then you also can't go about kind of narrowing your field to a degree that it loses kind of all meaning. And USCIS, does take issue if you define your field too narrowly as well. They're looking for evidence of your accomplishments that places you among leading professionals within a recognized area. Overall, I would say it's really about striking a balance. And when you're going to define your field, at the end of the day, this is something that you are going to do with your immigration counsel. But I think it's important to kind of understand some of the concepts around it ahead of time. So for example, the Administrative Appeals Office has issued some decisions in this area where they've talked about how you define your field for EB-1A purposes, and they've talked about defining your field too narrowly, and how that can risk kind of reducing all meaning towards what you're doing. And one of the cases that they talked about was essentially where a wine marketer argued that they kind of defined their field as being a wine marketer for a specific type of wine. And in that instance, the Administrative Appeals Office pushed back and said, you know, even if you can show that you are the top expert wine marketer in this specific wine, that is far too narrow of a field to really have any meaning. So they do push back if you define your area of expertise too narrowly. One advantage, though, is depending on what you're doing, USCIS officers are not experts. They often have little awareness of the different types of fields, of the different domains, of the different kind of subfields within different industry fields. So ultimately, when you're filing a case, oftentimes you're also educating them about the field itself and the specific area that you are in. So you can kind of keep that in mind because it does offer some level of flexibility in how you define your field as well. Apologies if you do hear that. That might be my daughter crying in the background if that comes through on the audio. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's about striking a balance when you're looking at kind of defining your field for EB-1A purposes. It is something that you're going to discuss with your immigration counsel. They're going to help you in kind of striking that balance between kind of determining who you should be comparing yourself to. You know, what is the specific field that we're going to outline in the petition? How are we going to explain it to USCIS? And how are we going to kind of strike that balance between the broad field, but narrowing it to kind of highlight your specific expertise. So for example, when we talk about kind of defining fields, another example that the government often gives is, so if you filed an EB-1A extraordinary ability petition for an NHL hockey player, and you were claiming that they'd risen to the top of their field by comparing them to all amateur and professional hockey players, that wouldn't be a fair comparison, right? That would be potentially misleading. So instead, the government pushes back and says, you know, the true comparison here would be to others within the specific league that they play in, so the NHL. So if you're arguing extraordinary ability for an NHL hockey player, you have to say, well, they're extraordinary within the NHL, or they're extraordinary within professional hockey players, not all athletes. So kind of similarly, if you're in, for example, a software field, you want to ensure that your field is kind of correctly defined, so that comparisons to others are relevant and they're accurate. So if you're in software engineering, for example, you might have a niche within that that you may want to define your field of expertise in, rather than saying and comparing yourself to all software engineers. That wouldn't necessarily be meaningful if your work is more focused in one specialized area. So let's say you're a software engineer for financial algorithms, for example, or machine learning. Then really the correct comparison and the stronger argument would be to peers that are also working in that specific specialized domain of your industry. So again, kind of defining your field properly is important for the outcome of the case. And it's really about ensuring that the comparisons that you're making are to professionals with similar expertise and recognition in your area. something that you do want to keep in mind is that you don't have to kind of, wherever you are in terms of the EB-1A petition, whether you've kind of initiated a case, you're thinking about it, whether you're kind of a senior level professional or whether you've kind of just entered your industry and you're considering, hopefully being able to apply for EB-1A years and years and years down the road. I think that's going to impact how you kind of look at your field, because you don't want to define it too narrowly early on as well. You kind of want to leave room for your career growth. And you also want to keep in mind that for EB-1A purposes, when you file this petition, you're stating to the government that when you become a lawful permanent resident in the United States, you're going to be continuing work in this specific field. So if you kind of narrow things too much, there's the potential that you might kind of pigeonhole yourself in that that kind of narrow field, and it won't kind of allow you to make, career changes that you want to make. There are arguments that you can make that, if you file an EB-1A, for example, and you say that you're researching one specific topic, and then in the end you end up researching another topic, your EB-1A may still be valid to use. So there are arguments there, but overall, again, it's really about striking that balance because you want to allow for some job flexibility later on as well. And again, kind of mentioning USCIS does not require that you prove to them that you're in the top 1% of your field. They've never in any policy guidance kind of indicated, exactly what they think in terms of percentiles is extraordinary ability. Percentiles are very arbitrary, and they're often not really helpful when defining extraordinary ability in specialized fields. So instead, I think, really you're kind of more focused and interested in showing objective evidence that demonstrates kind of significant impact. So for example, you create an algorithm that's kind of widely used, or an innovative software system that's cited by industry leaders or experts, that kind of speaks volumes about your status. You're invited to leading conferences, you're publishing in top-tier journals, you're being sought after for high-level advisory roles. This type of recognition and kind of peer validation establishes extraordinary ability without kind of relying on arbitrary percentiles as well. And ultimately, when you're thinking about kind of defining your field in an EB-1A petition in general, I think really the most compelling aspect of your EB-1A petition is the narrative that you create around your achievements. So making sure that you have specific, impactful contributions within your defined field. Ensuring that your story really highlights how your work has significantly influenced the industry. The narrative has to kind of be about outcomes, widespread adoption of your innovations or recognition by industry fields. So I think, ultimately at the end of the day, when you're looking at an EB-1A petition, it's about telling a cohesive, when you're defining your field and you're thinking about your career history, it's about telling a cohesive and compelling, interesting story to the officer about your accomplishments. Does anyone have any questions? Jason, did you have any questions that came up in the discussion?
So is this a valid way to define your niche? Define the problem you've helped solve for the industry and then show how you have solved that problem better than anyone else in the industry?
It can be, but I think that it also depends. Again, Yes, you do, but you still want to define your field broad enough that you are not stuck in that particular niche. So you don't have to continue your work in that particular niche if that's not where you want your career to go. So I think there's a lot of different factors that play into how you're going to ultimately define your field for EB-1A purposes. But certainly, I think um, maybe not when you're talking about defining your field, but when you're talking about presenting your case. I certainly think that's a compelling narrative where you want to point out a problem in your industry that you had a novel idea on how to solve and what the impact of what you did was. Uh, I certainly think that that kind of storytelling aspect is compelling. But I don't necessarily think that you have to kind of limit yourself to, maybe you've solved multiple problems in your industry and they're, you know, in different particular niches. And again, you have to keep in mind who the USCIS officer is too. The USCIS officer, like myself, does not understand all of the particular niches that exist in a particular industry, like software. I certainly don't know all of the domains and subdomains within software. And the USCIS officer who reads it is likely not going to know that either. So you don't have to be, there is, there is a reason to narrow your field, but you don't have to narrow it that much. You don't want to be kind of working in completely vastly different areas where somebody who, the average layperson is going to look at those two fields and understand that they're very different. But let's say you're working on two kind of different research areas, but there's a bridge between them. As long as you can explain that, as long as you have a way of kind of bridging those two fields, or as long as you kind of have a way, or sorry, maybe not broad fields, but bridging those two areas or two domains or two niches within a field, that should be fine. Again, it's kind of about just telling that consistent, interesting story.
So I don't see any questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So,
and again, I do think that there are multiple different factors that can determine how you kind of define your field. Ultimately, it's going to be between you and your immigration counsel, and your immigration counsel is going to help you navigate looking at your career history. How do we define your field while allowing for that flexibility, not narrowing it too much, leaving it broad enough to allow for some career growth, some career changes over time. But they're going to assist you in making the most, the strongest, most compelling argument that they can for your case, and kind of defining your field. And I think, if you're really early on in thinking about EB-1A, if you're kind of years off from potentially even qualifying to apply for EB-1A, you don't want to narrow your field, right? You don't want to try to define it this early, right? You want to leave open for opportunities wherever your career takes you, wherever your interests take you. You just want to keep in mind that if a layperson looks at your career and sees kind of that you're working on vastly different things, if a layperson can understand that, then a USCIS officer can kind of understand that. So again, you do want some cohesion there, but you don't have to be really strict from the get-go in terms of like, what is your focus? Your attorney can kind of help craft that narrative of how everything can kind of tie together.
So we do have a question. Some certifications require 10 or 15 years plus, 15 plus years of experience and real world projects to be able to apply to take an exam. Does having something like this in your field help showcase your niche? Example, pharma plus quality standards.
Yeah. So this doesn't fit into any specific EB-1A criteria. And this is actually something that came up the other day in looking at somebody's case, in a situation where someone had a CFA charter. Um, so they had taken multiple exams that were extremely difficult to pass. They had to have a certain level of experience, and they were within a very small group of people who had actually passed all of these exams globally. Um, and that might be kind of evidence that falls into kind of the all other category or criteria for EB-1A, but it is a more challenging argument to make because for EB-1A purposes, kind of years of experience alone, so education or education plus experience alone doesn't really equal extraordinary ability. Or taking exams don't necessarily, even if they are difficult, doesn't necessarily demonstrate extraordinary ability. You're really more focused on kind of impact in your field rather than accomplishing a specific milestone of passing certain, rigorous exams. I think it's certainly something that you can raise in an EB-1A petition, and you can potentially even argue under kind of the all other category of comparable evidence. But the government has said, education and experience alone, if that is what kind of qualifies you for, this achievement, that's not really showing the impact that you need. It's not necessarily showing that you've risen to the top of your field. So there's an argument there. There's definitely an argument. But, I think that it doesn't kind of neatly fit into the criteria. And, it's more compelling to show kind of examples of accomplishments that you have within your field, than passing a rigorous exam or passing an exam that requires 15 years of experience, if that makes sense.
So, what's an example of defining your field too narrowly versus too broadly?
Yeah, I think, and it has to be something that would be kind of, as I mentioned, a layperson would understand. So if you defined your field so narrowly that, you said that I'm one of 5 people that does this specific research area, for example, in the world, that might, actually playing that out, that might be fine. But it can lose meaning over time. So if you narrow too much, it can lose all meaning. So kind of the example I gave was the wine marketer that said, I am a wine marketer in a specific type of wine. That's too narrow. So if you're, talking about, I guess, following the research example, if you say I'm the top expert and you create, you go really far into your research and you figure out this one minute detail of your research and you say, I'm one of 4 people that in the world that has written a paper on X, Y, and Z. That could be compelling, but I think you would have to kind of prove that people, there's an audience for that. It's something that has still received wide recognition within kind of a broader field. You have to show that people are interested in that. You have to show that it has impact. You have to show kind of significant contributions. It created, it sparked a conversation within kind of a broader field. It garnered attention. I think it's not necessarily a winning argument to just narrow to the point that you can say, oh, now I'm in the top 1% because I've so far narrowed my field that, there's basically no one here but me, or very, 10 people in the world. you can definitely lose meaning. And I think that, again, you have to keep in mind that it's a lay person reading this as well. So you have to, if it's going to be kind of readily apparent, like the example of a wine marketer and a specific type of wine, if it's readily apparent to the reader that you've so narrowly defined your field that it's lost all meaning, and it's not an accurate comparison to you, then the government is certainly going to push back. So if you tried to, for example, so narrowly define your field that this can even be a good argument if you have a few papers, but they haven't been cited a lot. Sometimes the argument is that it's a really novel research area. So a couple of citations is actually meaningful. And it doesn't need hundreds of citations, because just a few citations actually means that on a global scale, it's garnered attention. People are talking about it. People are building off of the work. People are copying the work. People are continuing the work. But for that to happen, again, you kind of have to still prove that it sparked that conversation, and you have to prove that it's not because of just the fact that you've done, for the purposes of an EB-1A petition, narrowly defined that field. You have to more so prove that you actually just work in kind of a new research area. Does that make sense? Ask any clarifying questions as well, too.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions.
Yeah, but I certainly think that this is a conversation, and how you define your field, it's important for your case. And I think it's a conversation to have with Immigration Counsel if you're thinking about an EB-1A petition. And I wouldn't too narrowly define your field up front. I would keep it fairly broad if I was just starting my EB-1A journey, and see where your career and your interests take you. But for purposes of those individuals who are kind of already qualify for EB-1A, or just want to strengthen their EB-1A profile, for those individuals, I would definitely recommend having a conversation with their attorney about how they kind of define their field. But oftentimes, oftentimes it's a situation where somebody's coming to an immigration attorney wanting to file an EB-1A petition, and we look at your entire profile, we look at your career history, we look at your accomplishments, and we craft the narrative, and we, on our side, look at everything and tell you what that specific field that we think will work for you. Yeah. Are there any additional questions?
No other questions. So we can just end it there. There are no other questions.
Okay. Any questions on your side, Jason?
No other questions on my end.
Yeah. And again, if anybody has any additional questions and wants to have more of a personalized conversation about EB-1A petitions, they can always book a consultation with our office. We also provide free assessments for EB-1As and national interest waivers, so I strongly recommend taking advantage of those if it's something that you're considering and want to know what your chances are. And again, thank you for joining, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.